Thorns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. As the Senate gets down to the business of confirming the cabinet picks of President Biden, Senator Hawley has placed a hold on the fast-track confirmation of Biden's choice to be Secretary of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, based on concerns about border security. The hold on the appointment of the potential DHS Secretary raises the question of the role of the Department of Homeland Security. As today's guest, Ben Rohrbaugh, author of More or Less Afraid of Nearly Everything, Homeland Security, Borders, and Disaster in the 21st Century, points out, the Department of Homeland Security has been something of an unloved stepchild within the government structure, lacking both a consistent and coherent organizational culture, as well as at times the perception that it intrudes on the turf of other, more established agencies. Although Rohrbaugh outlines the case against the DHS, he comes to the conclusion based on an overview of a variety of issues, including pandemic disease, terrorism, including right-wing extremism, organized crime, natural disasters, and border security, that in fact the DHS is an important organization to dealing with the threats that the United States faces in the 21st century, especially those that don't stem from traditional states. This conversation, hosted at the Strauss Center by Stephanie Leutert, occurred in November 16th and so predates the inauguration of the Biden administration, but many of the issues and lessons are certainly timely as we evaluate these considerations today. Let's listen in.
So today I'm going to talk about an important question, which is what is the point of DHS? And this is the sort of fundamental question that my book, More or Less Afraid of Nearly Everything, is about. We'll soon reach 2 decades since the Department of Homeland Security was created. And more and more frequently, the question is arising, why did we do this reorganization? And was it a good idea? Was this all just sort of a reaction to 9/11 or an overreaction and something that should be wound down? And so sort of the bottom line up front, I do think there's a point to DHS and that the establishment of the department has important lessons that go sort of far beyond its missions. And I'll explain why today, but the fundamental point is that non-state risks, the kind of threats that the US government's security functions weren't created to address, are increasingly challenging the ability of government to respond. And DHS was, in this analysis, really just sort of the first step in responding to these, the first sort of reorganization and change in structure and strategy to deal with what are new threats that the government isn't well organized to deal with. Before I get to that, I'll start by acknowledging that the cases against DHS can be quite compelling. DHS is very unpopular. The department has been in the center of some of the worst political controversies of the Trump administration, from family separation at the border to response to protests in Oregon and in other places. Prominent mainstream figures have called for the department to be disbanded. People from former Senator Barbara Boxer, who was involved in the department being established, to President Obama's former Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes. And within government, DHS is pretty unpopular. A lot of other agencies, other more established agencies, tend to resent what they perceive as its incursions into their territory and their missions. I worked at the National Security Council. Most of the people at the National Security Council are detailed from other places, and the majority of them come from places like state or CIA, where there's this very established organizational cultures and clear hierarchies. And for most of them, DHS was something they didn't want to deal with. It was something that it was messy, and it was seen as immature and incompetent. And now it's been particularly seen as tainted by the Trump administration. And I think for people who come from organizations that are much more functional, and where when you work at a place like state or CIA, you're working with lots of people who are very motivated and who have worked their way up through competitive hierarchies, and people are very generally very well credentialed. And the sort of easiest question to ask when you're dealing with DHS is sort of like, why can't they get it together? Why is this they're just either ill prepared for meetings or incompetent or other things. Sort of, meanwhile, at the same time, the spirit of the time, the urgency that drove the establishment of the department, which was, of course, the frantic aftermath of the 9/11 attacks, is basically gone. The threat of spectacular mass casualty attacks by a group like Al-Qaeda or similar organizations has certainly receded from public attention. And the most consequential decision that was made at the same time as the establishment of DHS which was, of course, the decision to invade Iraq, the Iraq War. It was made by the same people largely who determined how DHS would be created, has been totally discredited. Now it's almost universally seen as a mistake and a disaster. And so at the same time, as now we're seeing, particularly through COVID, American civilians have never been are more vulnerable than they've been in at any point in recent history. We're of course seeing, it is affecting the format of this talk. We are seeing sort of staggering levels of disruption and sickness and death, while the government has largely flailed in response. And the fear and insecurity becomes sort of pervasive in the very homeland that DHS was created to secure. And so finally, on top of all this, as I finish the case against DHS, DHS itself seems often fairly confused about what it is and what it should be doing. Under the Trump administration, it's been all migration all the time. It's been all border security. But the department actually has incredibly broad missions, and the entities that are part of it do all kinds of very, very different things, from dignitary protection at the Secret Service to emergency response to FEMA, through activities of the Coast Guard and the littorals. I mean, it's really incredibly broad. And the department, because of that, has really struggled to articulate its strategy. And so you see this in particular in the department's mission statement, which is, I'll quote it here: "With honor and integrity, we safeguard the American people, our homeland, and our values," end quote. And so that's, it's a very nice sentiment, but that could be the mission statement of an insurance company. It doesn't really give you a sense of what the department does, especially when you compare it to like Department of Defense, where they say, our mission statement, our mission is to provide the military forces needed to deter war and protect the security of our country. I mean, that's clear. You know what the department does, even if you have differences with the way they do it. So given all this, it is fair to ask, what is the point of the Department of Homeland Security? Could we disband it and not have to worry about all these problems that seem to come up around the department and the department presents? And so my answer is no. And I think my take is a little bit different than what is often seen, and particularly in progressive political circles where I operate. I was an 8-year appointee of the Obama administration. So I think there was a point to creating DHS. And the point is that national security is no longer something that just happens in other countries, which was largely the American experience in the 20th century. There are a group of emerging threats. People use different terms. I'll describe them as either emerging threats or non-state threats in particular, that are putting civilians and their interests directly at risk in ways that, at a scale that previously was really only associated with foreign militaries. And our national security and law enforcement structures and strategies are very ill-suited to respond to this group of threats. And I'll go through them in detail. The United States is very well organized now to respond to national security threats that come from foreign governments, particularly foreign militaries. We're well organized to conduct international intelligence operations and counterintelligence operations. And we're, again, very well organized to pursue foreign policy advantage against other foreign nation states. But we're not well organized to respond to non-state threats. And I think the changes are going to continue. And really, in my analysis, DHS is really just sort of the first step in adapting to this, and the beginning of an adaptation that we'll see across government. I think we can either make these changes intentionally and in advance of crises that we know are going to come, or we can wait until the crisis manifests and then make decisions about how our strategies need to change and how these structures need to be adapted in the sort of frantic environment following those crises, which is obviously a worse way to do that. And I think this is particularly urgent right now because DHS was an example of the kind of decisions that are made in the aftermath of a crisis, and we're in another crisis that will likely result in major changes to government, of course, through COVID, where we could have either some new cabinet department, we could have some new cabinet secretary type official who's put in charge of pandemic response, and really could see significant changes that should be informed by the lessons of the experience we've had with the Department of Homeland Security. To me, the question is not, why did we create this? Why is DHS around? How can we go back to the structure we had before? But is instead, with the staggering resources that we put into national security, why are civilians increasingly vulnerable? How do we need to change our strategy and reorganize our government in order to do so? And what did we do right in establishing DHS, and what did we do wrong? now I'll go into a little bit more detail about what I mean when I'm talking about these threats. What are these sort of these specific things that I think have become so unmanageable for government, and why we haven't been effective at addressing them so far. So the backdrop on all of this is that non-state actors, entities, other companies, but particularly groups like organized criminal groups or terrorist groups or other things like that, have become much more potent than they previously were. And the key driver has been technological change. And so as the groups that I'll articulate are disease, and we'll talk through infectious disease and how that is challenging government. We'll talk through the changes in terrorism and how terrorist threats have been very difficult for the government to adapt to, although we've certainly gone through more adaptation since the 9/11 attacks in this area than in others. We'll talk about organized crime, why this has been particularly challenging. Talk about natural disasters, and then talk through cybersecurity, and then finally weapons of mass destruction. So these 6 areas, they're not all organizations, but they all are connected by the fact that they're increasingly empowering either non-state actors or non-state forces that are challenging government. So first, beginning with infectious disease, this is the most obvious one. It wasn't when I was writing the book in 2018 and 2019, but the key point I'll put across here about the COVID crisis and what we've seen is that COVID is a national security disaster. It's not something that maybe causes second-order national security disasters. It's something that is directly killing American civilians. And it just really needs to be emphasized because I think when we have a public discussion about national security, it's so informed by the 20th century experience and the specific kind of actions and threats that we dealt with in the 20th century, where there was this threat of an annihilating nuclear war, and everything was framed around this national security structure, that we don't tend to think of pandemic disease as something in national security. But to me, in this analysis, something that is directly killing thousands of Americans a day is something that is absolutely needs to be treated with the same urgency that we would treat, the Russians coming through West Germany, and is going to. It needs the same level of structural change that any other national security disaster would require. And so I think when we think about future pandemic disease threats, and we know we expect that there will be major changes as a result of this experience, but I think it's important to consider that they could be very different from the experience we're having in COVID and the way they manifest. And so they're basically, we know there could be other respiratory diseases, things like other SARS variations or something, different kinds of novel influenza. And this is something that we have sort of the most direct experience with through H1N1 and through currently COVID. But there could be other kinds of manifestations. And particularly, it could be groups of fluid contact diseases, things more like Ebola or other kind of Marburg or Hendra Lassa. And then we could have vector transmitted diseases where things where they're transmitted by fleas or mosquitoes or other kinds of pests, and all of these would result in very different pandemic experiences. Right now we're obviously focused on masks and public health and the way these can be transmitted through small areas, but a comparably alarming pandemic driven by mosquitoes would have just totally different consequences in the way we would conduct our daily lives and the way we would deal with everything. And so I think that the key point is just that variations in how viruses transmit can have enormous impacts in how we structure ourselves. And the reason that the federal government has had so much trouble in responding to this, aside from the specific pathologies of the Trump administration, is that the federal role in pandemic response is largely either funding research through the National Institutes of Health or BARDA or other entities like that, or it's coordinating among entities that it doesn't directly control. And so this was something when I was in the White House during Ebola response, and we saw that suddenly we were trying to coordinate across all kinds of different state, local, tribal, private entities. And that structure works well under sort of normal conditions, but when you have a national threat, it's very, very hard using the systems that exist now to coordinate a national response. And so even the pandemic plan that the Obama administration left for the Trump administration, which was certainly much better than the course of action that the Trump administration pursued at the beginning of the pandemic, but was fundamentally like a White House-driven strategy, which is what you have when you don't have good structures in place within government. Whenever you have the White House having to drive something, when they have to go in and coordinate across lots of different entities, that means that there isn't effective, there aren't effective ways to deal with it in place. I'll move on now to the threat of terrorism and how this is changing and why this has been so difficult for government as well. And this is the one that we've gone through the most adaptation to. But I think that the fundamental shift we've seen and the fundamental alarming change that has driven the way that government has adapted has been the shift from what we call sort of 20th century nation state driven terrorism to 21st century terrorism, which is much, much greater in scale, much more threatening, and where people really seek much more spectacular devastation. And I think the experience of 20th century terrorism was largely groups acting for control of a nation state or acting in competition with other groups for control of the nation states. And so there were certainly horrifying attacks, and certainly it certainly could be incredibly dangerous for civilians, but there wasn't the kind of massive attacks motivated by rejection of the modern world that we certainly see through Al-Qaeda and ISIS and other entities that are similar to those. And I think that there's a very important distinction between the way we think about 20th century terrorism and 21st century terrorism that needs to be drawn, because 21st century terrorism, groups that really have the characteristics of these transnational organizations, really need a very different approach. And I think we saw this when in the aftermath of 9/11, when major changes were taken throughout the counterterrorism enterprise, where there are very well documented failures of information sharing across the federal government, particularly with the FBI and the CIA, that certainly could have stopped the attacks. And then particularly, there were failures where the Immigration and Naturalization Service sent approved visas and sent them to 9/11 hijackers 6 months after the attacks had occurred. It showed just sort of how deficient the systems were across government to identify, trained operatives entering the United States and figure out how to respond to them. And since then, there've been dramatic changes where we've created a terrorist screening center. We have processes by which all information about terrorism are gathered into a specific database called TIDE, and then moved into watch lists through a series of nomination process. And that has made the government quite a bit more effective at making sure that information about terrorism is in the right place. And so the government has been sort of more effective in responding to threats we know and understand, threats like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. But this remains, I think, a particularly concerning area. And we know there are more radicalized people in the world now than there were before 9/11. Terrorist deaths every year around the world are still much higher than they were in the period before those attacks. And there are new threats. These are threats like particularly right-wing extremism or white supremacist groups that are evolving and could evolve to look much more like what we've associated with groups like Al-Qaeda in the future. The kind of attacks they pursue. And this is something that is going to need to remain sort of top of mind if the government's going to effectively respond. So the next area I'll talk about, next emerging threat, is with organized crime. And this is a place where the government has not adapted as successfully as it has in terms of counterterrorism. I think this is a place where much more of a change is going to be needed in the structure and response in order to be more effective. Organized crime, particularly in the 21st century, has become much, much more dangerous and has become much more well-resourced than the groups that existed in the 20th century and the groups for which we organized ourselves to respond. The United States law enforcement structure was very effective at responding to the mafia. Once it started to respond effectively, it was very effective, and is well organized to investigate groups domestically and respond to threats there. But it is very difficult for established organizations to deal with transnational criminal groups that have broad activities, that have lots of different revenue sources, and that have huge access to huge markets that make them incredibly potent and give them the ability to bring in enormous amounts of resources and apply serious challenges to even nation states in other places. And you see this particularly in Mexico and Central America, where there are real challenges to state sovereignty from some of these groups. And so the response, the response the United States government has pursued has largely been this investigate, arrest, extradite, and try process, which is what we've seen. They've been, even when we've had significant successes, like the arrest of Chapo Guzman, they haven't fundamentally affected the ability of these organizations to operate. And we still see groups like the Sinaloa cartel are still nearly as threatening as they were a decade ago, despite these efforts. And so it's a place where the government strategy and structure are going to need to adapt in order to be effective. And with this, that the way the United States deals with organized crime is largely driven by the DEA, which it has been since the FBI sort of backed off from organized crime in the wake of 9/11 when they switched their new responsibilities. But this is something where the kinds of international partnerships that need to be in place and the kinds of resources that need to go to this are just fundamentally going to have to shift. So the next area I'll talk about quickly is natural disasters, and I think everyone sees the results of this, the escalating intensity of disasters. I know folks have some folks have experienced it in places like California and Oregon very recently with wildfires. This year we've had the fastest progress through named hurricanes in history. There's a second hurricane right now that looks like it's going to hit Central America in a very short period of time. The climate-driven changes that are causing a climate-driven escalation in natural disasters is something that is overwhelming the ability of governments to respond, and is going to change the way we need to think about natural disasters, because the federal role now is fundamentally in coordinating different resources and getting different resources that already exist to places where there are disasters to respond. And the FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, does a good job coordinating across different parts of government, but it isn't fundamentally, and it's fundamentally taking resources that exist for other purposes and using them for disaster response. And increasingly what we're seeing is that there's going to have to be much more the kinds of resources that we normally associate with military actions are going to have to go into protecting civilians from disasters domestically, and also protecting civilians internationally. And this is, I think, a fundamental shift. There's also, FEMA is good at incident command and response, but it's not good at doing that when there are unresolved policy issues or when something is really novel. So, FEMA is fine if it's coordinating getting Coast Guard helicopters to respond to a hurricane in the Gulf or something, but it's not effective if you're dealing with a migration crisis on the border where there are still major security issues that, a migration crisis driven by a hurricane or something like that, where there are major policy issues that need to be addressed. The next area where the next sort of emerging threat, or this is a threat that's already emerged, people have been talking about this for decades, is clearly cybersecurity. The United States government, people have been talking about a cyber 9/11 since the immediate aftermath of 9/11, and before that they talked about a cyber Pearl Harbor. There's the Deputy Attorney General in the 90s was talking about this, and this. As we've moved to just all communication, all information being stored on digital systems that are subject to intrusion, there's been just sort of an endless parade of disasters and outrages can sort of become numb to. But there also hasn't been sort of 9/11 like incident that's really crystallized things in the public mind. And I suspect we will have those kinds of incidents as vulnerabilities grow and grow and grow, and how we have more and more intrusions. But it is important not to downplay how bad some of the disasters have already happened have been. Particularly things like the Equifax breach, which really stands out in its awfulness because most Americans whose information was breached didn't realize they weren't consenting directly to sharing information, their detailed credit history. And then on the government side, the government has been extremely negligent in protecting very, very important information. And this is something I've experienced personally. Is when I was in government, the Office of Personnel Management's computers in which they stored all of the information from people's security clearances, including my own, were hacked by, and it has been reported that were hackers related to the Chinese government. And it's as if all of us actually went through and applied for security clearances with the Chinese government and allowed them to interview all of our friends and family under threat of perjury to ask about our lifestyles. I mean, it's just really crazy, and will have implications that could manifest for years and years into the future. basically, the government has been so ineffective in responding to cybersecurity because it has treated it as a matter of intelligence competition with foreign governments. And the center of gravity in the United States has been always, and the center of gravity in the United States government for cybersecurity has been the National Security Agency, and then just the military as well. But the U.S. Cyber Command and the National Security Agency are dual-hatted now, and it's always been focused on offensive operations. And so whenever there's been a whole series of different times when different presidents have said, this is crazy, we need some sort of cybersecurity strategy, we need to deal with these vulnerabilities, each time the response it comes back ends up being something about active defense, and we'll go out and we'll interdict threats, or we'll go and we'll do something offensive. And part of that is just sort of how what these agencies do. The National Security Agency, of course, was created in the Cold War, and it's sort of the agency's sort of golden days were in intercepting communications from the Russian leadership, and that's what they want to keep doing. But they also are limited because they're intelligence agencies. They're not appropriate. They're not legally allowed to deal with domestic vulnerabilities on domestic systems. And so we have this situation where we keep putting resources in cybersecurity into agencies in the US government that can't actually deal with the direct vulnerabilities we have. And then the agencies that get put in charge of dealing with domestic vulnerabilities, whether it's the Department of Commerce, the National Institute of Standards, now the Department of Homeland Security, don't have resources and are seen as incompetent and then aren't able to actually address problems. So this is something that I think really is going to need to shift. There are going to need to be changes in the regulatory environment, and there's going to have to be, and there's going to need to be some kind of reorganization of the government's functions of this to actually get resources where they need to be in order to effectively respond. And then the last area I'll talk about, and this is one that is unpleasant and is one that I think has a lot of associations with the Iraq War for people, because it was the justification for the Iraq War was so focused on weapons of mass destruction. But I think weapons of mass destruction is an area that needs much more attention from the national security community and leadership, and one where the United States government is not particularly well organized to respond to the kinds of threats that are emerging, where technological changes have made it much more possible that non-state actors could actually obtain and use a weapon that could go far beyond anything we've previously seen. So first, nuclear weapons technology is now 75 years old. The key barrier to proliferation, the key barrier to a terrorist or other non-state group using a nuclear weapon is in obtaining the fissile material. The technology involved in actually creating a weapon has just been totally overwhelmed by progress, and it's something that is not difficult for organizations to do. There was even in 1977 a Princeton undergraduate used publicly available sources to design a nuclear weapon, and then his work was later classified after the FBI investigated it. But I mean, if that was possible in 1977, there aren't serious barriers on it now. And nuclear material has not been secured to the extent that I think any of us would like to have it seen, especially during the fall of the Soviet Union. But then the other area that is I think even more alarming are the possibility of biological weapons. And the key thing to think about with biological weapons, and the thing that is most alarming about them, is the possibility of something infectious being intentionally designed. And this is something that hasn't occurred yet. And I think a lot of people, a lot of us, or certainly I had when I came into government, associate biological weapons with sort of these like Cold War, there's a laboratory somewhere in Siberia where they're, keeping smallpox samples or something. But it's something where the advances in the advances in biotechnology have empowered very small organizations like companies to create things that go way beyond what even superpower funded laboratories could do during the Cold War. And the possibility particularly of some kind of very, very infectious, very dangerous disease being created by a small organization and then released is, I think, incredibly alarming, and one that isn't being treated with the kind of concern that would be appropriate to the scale of the threat. And particularly, information about these kind of things keeps getting published by organizations or journals, and very, very stuff that could be very, very sensitive is made public by researchers in the name of research. And then there certainly are viable reasons for doing it, but they I think often not thinking through what the possible consequences could be. And so just a quick example of this is that Canadian researchers published a detailed explanation of how they'd assembled a smallpox-like virus using available DNA samples purchased over the internet. Stuff like this in the wrong hands is really kind of scary. And as we've seen, the U.S. government has a very difficult time responding to new, novel diseases. And so this is something that I think deserves a lot more public attention. What are, as I've gone through this parade of horribles and described these things that I think are going to change government, what are the lessons then, and what are the sort of key takeaways as we think about DHS and what this means for this, and also why hasn't DHS fixed all of these? And so DHS has consolidated certain functions, but a lot of them, as I've described, still aren't something that's been effectively dealt with. We've certainly got a much more effective counterterrorism structure now than we had previously, but on a lot of these other things, cybersecurity, organized crime, et cetera, weapons of mass destruction, there haven't been the kinds of shifts that'd be necessary to really address the scale of the threat. And so to me, the key lessons from this and from the experience of DHS and some of the disorganization around it are that we need to focus as a public who's interested, and as also officials who may be involved, we need to focus on managing this transition, where instead of where as government starts to do something new, and as it creates new organizations, and as it follows new strategies, we need to manage the process to make sure that there aren't overreaches, that there aren't abuses and other things, but that also that they're being effective and focusing on this new strategy. That anytime you're shifting things around in government, there are always opportunities for overreach, or fraud, waste, and abuse, things like that. And it also, at the same time, will be adapting legal structures. And there will be either legal changes, or there will be shifts in the authorities that entities are using as they pursue new strategies to deal with things like cybersecurity or other threats that move across traditional boundaries. And this is difficult to manage, particularly when there's things like questions about privacy and how you reconcile sort of things that the government needs to do with concerns about those things being invasive. Oversight, particularly congressional oversight, needs to balance concerns about incompetence and waste with the fundamental point about whether or not the new agencies are actually or new entities are being effective at their missions. And the easiest thing for overseers to do is always to find and punish incompetence. But I think that it's much more important to actually make sure that the strategies that entities are following are sound and get to where we want, than just finding places where someone has screwed up an acquisition procedure or something like that. And then for advocates, there's this. I think the focus really needs to be on, as the government adapts this, not whether government is doing something new, but whether what they're doing is appropriate to the risk that they're trying to address, and whether there are appropriate protections in place to defend against abuse as they're doing this. Or with that, I'll conclude and say basically that that there is a point to DHS. People should broadly be interested in the lessons of the department. It really was the first sort of clumsy step in adapting the U.S. government security structure to these new non-state threats that we've gone through in detail. And that other parts of government are going to have to shift, much like DHS. And so we really should think about this as we go through those processes, whether or not it's thoughtfully beforehand or whether it's in the aftermath of crisis.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma. And please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.